name is Andrea Keith, and I'm the Executive Director of Let Grow. I'm really happy to have you here. This is going to be, I think, a real fun one. This month's webinar is called How Adults Got Spooked About Halloween, because Halloween used to be the time when kids kind of ruled the streets and they were out running around in the neighborhoods, dressed up, doing things like, I don't know, asking for candy or sometimes tricks, which were not so nice. And it's something that's changed drastically over the years. I will tell you that I love Halloween, and I've lived in, as a child, too many different places to count. And trick-or-treating was something that back in the, I will say, it was the 70s, was, pretty popular. And I was lucky. I had a father who made fabulous costumes. I was a mailbox one year. I think I was about 7, and literally the big mailboxes, and he made it out of cardboard, and my face was in the opening. Anyway, just nostalgic memories. Couple of housekeeping things before we get started. As you're here, we do have all of you muted, and if you would like to have back chat in the chat, you're welcome to do that. And we also have a Q&A open if you want to ask any questions of our panelists or Lenore. At the end, we'll leave about 15 minutes for that. And I will take those from the Q&A. I do also kind of monitor the chat during it, but if you have an actual question you'd like answered by a panelist, please put it in the Q&A so that I don't miss it. This is also being recorded, as I mentioned earlier, so the recording will be automatically sent to you. I send out a follow-up email later today, and you will get information on how to contact the panelists if they're amenable, as well as a link to the recording and any other links or good stuff that comes up during the middle of this. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our wonderful co-founder and president, Lenore Skenazy.
And here I am. So thank you, Andrea. I have to say, I am so psyched for today. I have been interviewing, reading, talking to, stalking our 2 guests today for years. I mean, literally years. I was looking up Joel Best the other day, and I found an article that I had done for the New York Daily News in 1998 about Halloween fears, in which I quote, guess who? Professor Best himself. And then as I was rereading Paula Fass's, I'd say, amazing book about child kidnapping, everybody should read it, I realized, here's the book, okay? You open it up, and the dedication there is from 2011. So these are people I have really venerated and learned so much from. And now I get them together. And I think this is really the first time they've been speaking together, even though they both cover something that has fascinated me for a long time too, which is the real world consequences of imagined or greatly exaggerated danger, how those fears end up influencing our culture and our parenting. So let me give you the official bios here. Joel Best. Joel is the best. Joel is a professor of sociology and criminal justice at the University of Delaware. He's been tracking reports of contaminated Halloween treats since, oh my God, 1985. And he is the author of, get ready for a lot of books, A Random Violence, How We Talk About New Crimes and New Victims, Damned Lies and Statistics, Untangling Numbers from the Media, Politicians, and Activists, and then More Damned Lies and Statistics, How Numbers Confuse Public Issues. That is very relevant today. Something on social problems, stat spotting, which is a field guide to dubious data. Is that true? Do you get the idea that he's a skeptic here and really trying to get to the bottom of sociological events and panics? I do. This one really impressed me. The Satanism Scare. He wrote that in 1981. It was published in 1981. He probably wrote it in 1990. And that's before many people had even realized that it was just a scare. I mean, he was really ahead of the curve there. And then the book that's most relevant to us today, I've got it right here, is this one, Threatened Children, Rhetoric and Concern About Child Victims. Paula Fass, who put on an orange and black necklace just for us, thank you so much, is no slouch either. She's a professor of history emerita at the University of California, Berkeley, and author of, another long list, The End of American Childhood, possibly ending this Halloween, A History of Parenting from Life on the Frontier to the Managed Child. Also, The Damned and the Beautiful, American Youth in the 1920s. Outside In, Minorities and the Transformation of American Education. And the Encyclopedia of Children and Childhood, that's pretty definitive. She also wrote Inheriting the Holocaust, a second generation memoir. And yes, that's about her own family. And then for today's purposes, she wrote the one I was just talking about before, Kidnapped, Child Abduction in America. I don't think you could find two people who have thought about this issue more deeply or researched it more or are willing to talk to me about it at noon today than these two fantastic people and professors. So thank you both for joining me. And I think, Joel, we have to start with you because the question of the hour, the question I was writing about in 1998, the question you've been researching for 30 or 40 years now is poisoning kids on Halloween. Let's talk about that. How many kids have been poisoned by a stranger's candy on Halloween?
Well, you can't know that, but I've looked at press coverage that goes back to 1958.
Wow.
And I cannot find evidence that any child has ever been killed or seriously injured by a contaminated treat picked up in the course of trick-or-treating. Now, there was a dad who murdered his son, but I don't count that because, when people are asking, is it safe to go trick-or-treating? They're not thinking, is it safe if I'm going to murder my kid to go trick-or-treating? So the bottom line is that this is a contemporary legend. It's something that everybody knows is true, and there's no evidence to support it.
Wow. Can you just tell me a little bit about the dad? What happened in that case?
This was a guy named Ronald O'Brien. He lived in a suburb of Houston. And I assume that he thought he'd heard the legend, and he thought that the police were just overwhelmed with little dead bodies on Halloween, and so he could commit the perfect crime. And he took out a life insurance policy on his son, purchased some poison, poisoned his child, and then reported it to the police. And for a couple of days, the police thought, oh my goodness, it's one of those maniacs poisoning children. And then they realized that there weren't any other kids with poisoned candy, and they started to discover that he'd taken out this life insurance policy and so on. He was arrested, tried, convicted of murder, and it being Texas, was executed. Now, he never confessed to the crime,
Wow.
but he's the so-called candy man.
Wow. And did he actually poison candy, or he just put poison in it?
He put poison in a pixie stick. He mixed the granulated sugar, and he mixed poison in that. And the story goes, and I don't know that this is true, but this is my impression, that he gave the kid, his son, this pixie stick at the start of the evening, and they carried around trick-or-treating. And when they came home, he supposedly said, okay, you can have one piece of candy before you go to bed. What do you want to have? Oh, but it's that pixie stick, huh? And the child did eat the pixie stick and died.
Wow.
And this
All right. So
6 or 8-year-old boy.
Oh, 6. So the point is, if that was the only case of poison candy, obviously the myth had already been out there, because he thought that so many people were poisoning kids on Halloween. So do you know where the myth came from?
No, Halloween, trick-or-treating isn't as old as you think it is.
How old is it? I have no idea.
Well, it really spreads in the post-war period. And the reason is that there are communities, they're getting tired of adolescent boys going out and, tipping over outhouses and performing other acts of vandalism. And so trick-or-treating is kind of a campaign against delinquency. And, the custom was there, but it becomes institutionalized in different communities. And they say, okay, everybody's going to go out at this time on this night. They're going to wear costumes and, so on and so forth. And
wow.
So this is, by the early 1950s, there were stories of people heating pennies in skillets and dumping the hot coins into the outstretched hands of trick-or-treaters. So, right from the very beginning, there's this concern that kids are being, endangered by the people that are supposedly handing out treats.
So Halloween was a holiday already, but it generally involved mischief or actual vandalism.
Halloween has a very complicated history. It's celebrated in all kinds of ways. Some of them are, bobbing for apples. Some of them are kind of spooky. There was a folk belief that a young woman who went into a dark room with a candle and looked in a mirror would see the face of the man she would marry. Okay. And, stuff like that. So it doesn't have one way of being celebrated. And by the 1920s, 1930s, a lot of young boys are going out in acts of vandalism. Now, there's also some trick-or-treating at that point, but it really becomes the sort of big holiday that we think of it in the post-war period.
Wow. Did you know that, Paula? I didn't know any of that.
I did not know that, but I do know that going back quite far historically, you've got feats and feast inversion, but inversion where the young people take over. They were called charivaris, and young people would take over that day and actually expose the things that adults were doing that went against the norms of the culture. So I assumed that Halloween, and obviously it's not a correct assumption, was part of that kind of inversion of who's in power. Rather than adults being in power, the young people were in power. This is obviously a kind of expression of it, but the fact that it's so recent really surprises me.
Well, you have a long history of harvest festivals, and things like that. So it's a time of year when people are going to celebrate. And, in a lot of traditional holidays, you do have that kind of flipping, the Lord misrule and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Fascinating. And that it started really as an American holiday, the kind of trick-or-treating that we do, but now it's everywhere.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes.
Like all over, like in England and
The Swedes love trick-or-treating on Halloween. What I'd like to ask Joel is, are they as spooked as we are? Are they in other societies, in other nations? Are they fearful for their children in the same way that we've become fearful of strangers giving our children bad candy?
I don't know. I've been doing this for a long time, and I get press interviews, every year. I'm talking to reporters, and I had one Dutch reporter come to me one time, but he was interested in the story as just sort of a crazy bit of Americana, and so I don't hear about these fears in other countries, and nobody's ever contacted me for commentary or anything.
Interesting.
If they were going to contact anyone, they would contact you. So, Joel, I think even when I was interviewing you in 1998 for my Halloween story, you sounded a little fed up.
Oh.
You said like, I'm going to get these calls until I die or something like that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, this is, it's very interesting. This is a lesson in humility. Anytime an academic thinks that I'm going to put the word out and it's going to correct things, I've been in very visible venues. I was on the Today Show in 1985, and I've been in the Reader's Digest, and just all kinds of places. And every year, there are reporters that come back, and in most years, it's around October 15th, and I haven't heard from anybody. And I started thinking, well, maybe this is the year that it dies out. And then the calls start. And of course, this year with Rainbow Fentanyl, crazy, even in September.
Paula, have you heard about the Rainbow Fentanyl fear?
No, but I'm beginning to imagine it.
Right. Joel, can you talk us down from our fear of our children being poisoned by Rainbow Fentanyl?
Absolutely. In late August, the Drug Enforcement Administration put out a press release, and this is the kind of press release that government agencies are putting out continually. It's just there are billions of them, and this said that fentanyl is being manufactured in colors, and they had pictures of red ones and blue ones and so on, and this may be an effort to appeal to younger drug users. Now, a couple things you need to understand. First of all, the pills in the pictures are not fentanyl, because if you had that much fentanyl, it would kill you. Fentanyl is an extremely powerful opioid. So what these pills will be is some sort of cocktail of oxycodone and so on and so forth, with a little fentanyl added for spice. And the danger, one of the reasons you have so many drug overdoses is you never know just how much fentanyl is in these pills that you're getting. And so anyway, they released this, and a couple of weeks later, Ronna McDaniel, who's the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee, I think, was being interviewed on Fox. And she said, kind of spontaneously, I think, well, we've got this rainbow fentanyl, and, this is going to get passed out on Halloween, and mothers across America are worried that their children are going to get this in their treats. And at that point, it gets picked up. There are some Fox News personalities that suggest that maybe we should ban Halloween this year. There's a public service announcement with several Republican senators. Chuck Schumer got in to explain that Democrats were against rainbow fentanyl too, and so on. So
Glad he clarified that.
This is very, very unusual, because typically this is just a story that spreads through folklore, and everybody knows it's true. And the fentanyl thing is the first time that I can recall when visible political figures and media figures really came down and emphasized the danger. And so and this has been debunked by everybody, because it's a ridiculous story, but it's certainly out there.
But it latches on to the concern that a lot of parents have, correct concerns about fentanyl, which is usually obviously for their teenage children, that has created an epidemic of death. So there's some little bit of truth that now completely expanded into a lie, and that part, that in a sense, that is part of what we are talking about. And that's the fears that American parents have are usually begin with some germ of truth. This was certainly the case with kidnapping of children. There were some children kidnapped by strangers, and that's been true in the United States since the 19th century. We can literally, I've tried to trace that, but that then becomes exploited by people who have a vested interest in making this a big event, making this a real news cycle event. And that's, again, also been true over the course of time. So whatever kind of media have existed in the past have exploited these things so that parents become inflamed with fear and anxiety. And Joel and I both kind of work this particular territory.
You do. So, I was rereading your book about kidnappings and the different ones that have sort of shaped our fears over the years. And I was wondering if you could talk about, I'd say a more recent one, even though I was reading about little Charlie Ross, who was taken in the 1800s, and then Leopold and Loeb, who were thrill killers, young men, so brilliant and handsome, and they killed a boy in the 20s, and the impact of that. But I guess because I'm my age, I'd say the one that had the most impact relatively recently was, well, it's both of them. It's Eitan Pates and Adam Walsh. But I wonder if you could talk about the Eitan Pates case a little.
The Eitan Pates case was actually a really significant transformational moment. Eitan was kidnapped in 1979 in New York City, in a lower Manhattan neighborhood, when he was going to the bus stop on his own for the very first time. His parents had, for the first time, allowed this 6-year-old to walk to the bus. And they did not know that he had never arrived in school. They didn't know that until he didn't come home, and then the story kind of unfolded. initially, the concern about Eitan was maybe he wandered away. I mean, maybe he went with somebody whom he knew, because the kind of issue that the Pates case eventually resulted in, the fear that the child would be taken to be exploited sexually and then murdered, was really not the dominant vision on the horizon. And the police and everybody else were floundering around to figure out what was going on. Had a parent been involved? Had a wider family member been involved? And then by 1981, when the next really big case came on the horizon, which was Kevin White in San Francisco. By that point, there had been an enormous amount of information out there about sexual predators. And it's that transitional moment between 1979 and 1981 that I think is the critical point in American kidnapping history, where it democratizes kidnapping. I hate to put it that
It's a weird word. What do you mean?
Weird concept. But previously, most of the kidnappings had been for ransom, even though, as you mentioned, Lenore, even in the 1920s, there had been this imagined vision of predators around the Franks case, the Leopold and Loeb case. But the dominant image was that of people who had money who needed to fear for their children, or people who had celebrity status, like Charles Lindbergh,
yeah.
who needed to fear for their children. But by the 1980s, as I say, everybody became terrified for their children, because anybody can be taken for sexual exploitation and to be murdered. And so it's that trajectory that the Pates case creates. Now, you mentioned the other case, of course, which took place actually a little earlier than the Eitan Pates case. If I remember correctly.
Which case?
Adam Walsh.
No, he was a couple of years later.
Was it a couple of years later, really?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there, of course, you then get the exploitation that begins to take place on television. In 1983, if I remember correctly, that Walsh case was turned into a television program. And
nodding, yes.
very, very famous one. And subsequently, of course, Adam Walsh's father himself became a feature on television. So various media become deeply involved. So the studies that I did of that period of time, of the 1980s, sees a very rapid progression, that has something to do with numbers too. And here, Joe may want to talk a little bit about that, because what the media did was to exploit a variety of missing children issues, which included runaways, family abductions, as well as the abductions by strangers, which were the most horrifying, a kind of Halloween horror abductions. And so they came up with these enormous numbers. Yeah. So eventually you got 500,000 children every year being kidnapped, was what went out there. And a huge campaign took place to guard your children. And the anxiety of American parents, of course, grew and grew. And the anxiety, we should say, of American children also grew. I mean, they would sit at the breakfast table and look at a container of milk which had a picture of a missing child. Terrifying. And I think that did not really calm down to some degree.
Ever.
We're still seeing the reverberations of it, but it calmed down in the specifics of kidnapping, I think, in the early 90s, when statistics came out that made it quite clear that the number of stranger abductions was probably no more than 200 a year, but the number of family abductions was closer to 200,000 a year, and the number of runaways was closer to 400,000 a year. So it was called the Nismark studies that came out at that point. Between that time, all kinds of agencies came into effect. There were American laws, federal laws against that created the role of the FBI in spreading information, created lists, and created an agency in Washington or right outside Washington for missing and abducted children. So there was tremendous terror, I think, that dominated that period of time. Happened to also be the period of time in which I had my children.
Oh, great. I hope you have them safely locked in a room upstairs right now.
I had them safely locked in the past. They've now escaped. But, you know, that was the origin of my writing and researching this book.
Right. So, Joel, I think the thing that most people can't believe is that when the horrible Eitan Pates case happened, that at first nobody was thinking predator. I don't think the word predator had become common parlance yet, right? What's the story?
Oh, no. Well, people have worried about different aspects of this in different ways. During the 1970s, there's an effort to draw attention to the problem of child snatching. And child snatching meant in those days what we would now call family abductions. Typically, it involves a couple that get divorced. There's a custody arrangement, for one reason or another. The non-custodial parent usually decides to take the child. And sometimes, these are very elaborate things. They move to another state and take on another name and, so on and so forth. And these people kept going to Congress and asking Congress to do something about it. There's hearing after hearing during the 1970s. And
about asking Congress to do something about custody battles where the divorced dad takes the kid or vice versa.
Let's make this a federal offense, et cetera. And people, people are looking at this. They don't want to touch it to the barge pole, because this is, can't you people, have a civilized divorce, but this becomes a very organized movement, and there are groups like Child Find, and they're doing things like publishing little catalogs where they will have pictures of mugshots, but J.C. Penney pictures of kids who have now vanished. And they would print these up and they would send them to school principals around the country with the idea that the principal is going to sit down and look through it and say, hey, that kid's,
in second grade,
is in our third grade, And so they were pretty well organized and they were getting no respect. And what happens is that some genius, and I don't know who this was, creates the term missing child. And missing child combines three things. It combines the organizational facility of the child snatching group, because they knew how to have a press conference and get media exposure and so on. And it combines that with the kidnappings, the sort of Adam Walsh, Eitan Pates events, which are terrifying. And you tell the story, Adam Walsh goes to the mall with his mother and she never sees him alive again. And weeks later, they find his head. That's the worst story in the history of the world. And so, you tell that story and it's really gasp. And then you say, Adam Walsh is a missing child. Okay. And, what that does is it says this isn't a terrible incident. This is an instance of some larger problem. And then you couple that with the third group that you're concerned with, which is runaways. And people have been worried about runaways since they, Haight-Ashbury, it'd been a big deal.
Earlier.
Well, yeah, sure. But it becomes this idea, and the runaway stories are always typified by, blonde girls from Minnesota winding up as streetwalkers on the Minnesota Strip in Manhattan and, so on. And there were big statistics for runaways, and nobody knew how many runaways there were, but people were tossing around the idea that there might be 1.8 million runaways a year. Wow. So now you do. Here's your story. This could be in an article in Newsweek. It could be an item on the CBS News. Here's the story of Adam Walsh. This will scare you to death. Okay, Adam Walsh is a missing child. And there are 2 million missing children each year.
There you go.
So they mashed up all these different statistics together, the runaways, the custody battle kids, and the rare stranger abducted kids, and suddenly you have millions.
Yeah, and that invites you to imagine a kind of mountain of little heads someplace, which of course,
Like behind you now.
But the mountain became, I mean, I think Joel has put his finger on the key term here, and that was missing. And all of the missing posters out there would say missing. And missing had so many meanings, in a sense. They were missing from our lives. They were missing to the society. We were missing them individually. And I mean, I think the term missing was a brilliant stroke, actually. And it defined the campaign for a long time to go. And it wasn't heads after a while, Joel, that was at issue. Because do you remember when the police departments would have the people would bring their infants and they would take their footprints.
Yeah.
They'd take the footprints to have them, to have them on record so that if they found a missing infant or a corpse, they would be able to identify who the child was, who the infant was.
Right. So do you think, can I just ask a question? Do you think it was deliberate? Do you think the mashing up of the horrifying stranger danger cases versus a mom taking the kid from a custodial dad versus a runaway, was that a deliberate attempt to scare us into thinking all children could be in danger all the time?
I think that if you have a child that is missing, through a child snatching or whatever, this is a really important issue to you. I mean, enormously important.
Right.
And if you start hanging out with other people who have similar stories to tell, you're in a kind of hothouse environment where you are saying this is a giant problem. And when the press comes and says, well, how big a problem is it? You say, well, it's giant, 2 million a year. And I don't think that you have to be terribly cynical to do this. I think that these people could have been perfectly sincere. Now they were making up statistics left and right, but I think that they were motivated by their own tragedies and their contacts with other people who had terrible stories to tell.
So
I wouldn't absolve the media here. I agree with what Joel said, and that is to the individuals to whom this had happened for whatever reason, this was a terrible experience. Whether it was a stranger abduction or a custodial abduction, it was a terrible experience. But the media had for over a century been accustomed to exploiting cases of children who somehow had been abducted, exploited, killed, etc. And they knew exactly what they were doing. And it was front and center, and it was repeated again and again and again. And you know that. And the results of that was to really elevate American, misunderstanding, first of all, as Joel very well knows, but also the anxiety level of parents. So that if it was everywhere, in every newspaper that this case had happened, and then next week some other case had happened, and believe it or not, it was in a small town in Minnesota, so that nobody was safe. Could be New York, it could be San Francisco, but it could be St. Joseph, Minnesota, or Petaluma, California. So literally nobody was safe. And that I think the media cannot be absolved of responsibility, because they did it intentionally, because they knew exactly what the response would be.
Because it's a story that sells papers and gets eyeballs, etc. So there was that the Denver Post took those statistics down, right? Did they get a Pulitzer Prize?
Yeah.
Can one of you tell me about that? What happened at the Denver Post?
They published a paper, and I think their expression was the numbers gap. It was they worked gap into it, and they took these numbers, 2 million missing kids, and John Walsh at one point in a moment of enthusiasm said, testified someplace that there were 50,000 little bodies being discovered every year, and so on. And then they went to the FBI, because the FBI is, kidnapping is famously a federal crime. Now it's federal crime under particular circumstances, but they asked the FBI how many child kidnappings were there. And I forgot what the number was. It was something like 100 or 200 or something like that. And so they had this graph, and here's 50,000 and here's the number of FBI cases. And the argument was there has to be something wrong here, which of course there was. And that actually led to the Nismart studies, which would come out some years later, because there was this debate about, how many of these kids are there? It's a giant problem. Well, there are only a handful that are being investigated by the FBI. Are the FBI failing to do their job? What's going on? And so that's what happened there.
Did it change things? I mean, I feel like the Denver Post article, which I never actually read, punctured the idea that children were being kidnapped right and left. And then we were still left with the fear.
Yeah. Well, and we were left with the rest of the legacy that Paula was talking about. We were left with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and which continues to it's not a federal agency, but it continues to receive federal funding, and they're in the business of searching for missing children, but also publicizing the search for missing children. And their officials would go to Congress and make the case. Listen, it doesn't matter, how big the number is. One missing child is too many, and then, you should be very, very scared. And even if there's only one, you should be very, very scared.
So can we go back to Halloween for a second now? And do we think that impacted, why parents are with their kids now when they go trick-or-treating, or why some towns don't have trick-or-treating? They substitute something called trunk or treat, where there's a bunch of cars in a parking lot and kids go from car to car and take food, take candy from the trunks instead of going door to door. Do you think that the Adam Walsh fear changed Halloween?
I think we got into a period in the 1980s when we were worrying about missing children. We had the term child sexual abuse had come into play. Child pornography was getting attention. So there were all of these things that were kind of bundled together, and you can find this in popular culture. I mean, this is when Stephen King is writing about the town where all the children go missing, and so on and so forth. And so I think there's a kind of general anxiety about children that really takes hold in that period. And I don't think that we've ever left it. And I think we haven't left it because the media has transformed itself into a vehicle for making fears very, very easily transmitted.
Have we left other fears? I mean, Paula, when I read your book, it sounded like, fear for this, for kids being ransomed, went up and came down, fears of the crazy young juvenile delinquents who are thrill killers. I don't think that's haunting us these days, but
I have to say, I think that we have no longer experienced the same repeated stories, narratives of children being abducted by strangers. And I don't think that if you ask most parents today if they're afraid that their children will be abducted by a stranger, I don't think that's the fear that they're going to express. But I do think the sexual predator thing continues. And that, of course, is fed by the Catholic Church and the Boy Scouts and everything else. So the sexualization of children and our fears of the molestation of children, that I think is still very prominently part of the culture. And
actually,
anxiety in general, yes. But the fear about stranger abductions, I don't think so.
That's interesting, because I think the thing that I hear a lot and that I see on Facebook is often moms writing, I was at, Target or IKEA or the grocery store yesterday, and there was a guy or two guys looking at my child, and we were in, the canned pea aisle, and then we were over in the milk aisle, and there they were again. And I have no doubt that they were planning to sex traffic my child.
There you
go.
Yeah.
That seems to be where we've landed now. And everybody, for some reason, whenever anybody writes one of these posts and they come up, they were more common, I would say 2 years ago, but I still see them now. And they always say, and name of town is the #2 town for sex trafficking in all of America. They never say it's #1, but it sounds believable to always be #2. And then they get a cascade of praise in the comments, like, thank God you were alert. Those guys were up to no good. You can't be too safe. You're a mama bear. Good for you. And then once in a while, someone will say, but there was no proof that those kids, that those guys were doing anything other than buying peas and milk. And it's like, don't you care about children? So it does seem to be morphing a little to sex trafficking from murder. But I still don't see as many kids trick-or-treating on their own as the olden days. And I'm wondering where this mashup happens.
Well, but because they can be identified to be sex trafficked.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I mean, in other words, that the anxiety about your children being abused has not subsided, nor has the onus that's put on parents to make sure that whoever else's child is taken, it's not yours.
Yeah.
That was part of what happened with the kidnapping, and that is everybody felt terrible for the parents of the kidnapped child. But above all, the lesson was, you make sure that you guard your child to such a degree that it will never happen to you, so that you're never exposed, as Eitan Pates's mother, Julie, was, to commentary when she went outside, where people said, we feel so terrible for you, but of course you were careless with your child, basically. So, I mean, I think that has not disappeared. And it hasn't disappeared because many of the larger factors that surrounded this whole period haven't disappeared. Mothers are still going to work. So the mothers have the guilt, fixation, fear of what's happening to their children. And because other mothers are also going to work, there are no neighborhood moms around watching the kids. Divorce rates are still very high. And so there are strangers in the household, boyfriends, who could be molesting your child.
Oh my God.
So, I mean, there's all of those matters are still there. They haven't disappeared. The larger foundations for it are still there.
Yeah. What it seems to me is that, we realized that we were blaming the victims when we talked about rape cases. Finally, we realized, like, it wasn't that she was asking to be raped. She just wasn't, that she wore the wrong skirt or was in the wrong neighborhood. Nobody asked to be raped. So we don't blame rape victims now, but we do blame parents, right? We always think, oh, I would have never let them stay at home for 10 minutes. I would have never left them in the car. I would have never. And I think the fear of being shamed and blamed for something is one of the biggest fears that parents are dealing with. Sometimes when I ask people, why don't you let your kid, walk 2 blocks away? The response is, I could never live with myself if something terrible happened. So it's not that they even expect something terrible to happen. It's that they've already gone to the point where they imagine looking back at themselves and hating themselves. It's a weird thing. It's like they're not almost worried about the murder or the kidnapping. They're worried about how terrible they will feel about themselves. I don't know if you've noticed that too, but that's something that I keep chewing on. It's like,
and notice that we, we're doing all kinds of things to protect kids. When my oldest son was small, I would Saturdays I'd take him out in the car, and he'd be in a car seat, sitting next to me, facing forward, and it was an approved car seat. And today it looks like, it was made out of tinfoil or something. My grandchildren travel around in the back seat when they're very small. They actually face the rear of the car, and they're in these Kevlar encased pods. Our ideas about what we need to do to keep children safe have ramped up. And obviously, I'm sure that makes, I'm sure that being in the back seat facing backwards in the Kevlar encased pod is safer than being in the front seat. But it's a symbol of how we are viewing everything in the world as incredibly dangerous. We have to take extraordinary precautions to protect kids.
And
I had
all of those playgrounds that have been ripped out
Oh,
because
yeah.
they're safe for children. I mean, it's the same idea, that we can bring it down to a point where there is no risk at all, which of course
Right.
is absurd. That doesn't.
Wait, do you know what's happening in Germany? Where they've started, the insurance agencies are begging the schools and parks to build riskier playgrounds because they are so sick of fielding all these claims for young people who are not looking where they're going because they've almost never developed the need to make sure that they're okay because everything has been so safe. Yeah.
Something that I'm sure people can do on YouTube is there's a series of British documentaries called 7 Up. And if you go and see the introduction to the very first one, you'll see these children who are brought together. They're age 7.
Yeah.
And they're from all over England. And they've been brought together in an adventure playground in London. And to watch them running around, and they're on huge planks and all kinds of things. This is terrifying. I mean, to my eyes, you look at this, you think, holy cow. And today we have these upholstered settings where absolutely nothing bad can happen.
Part of it is the litigiousness too. I mean, I wrote a story a couple of years ago about parents who sued a New Jersey school because their kid fell off the slide and broke her arm. And they got a win because they convinced the jury that the slide was at 35 degrees and it should have only been at a 30-degree angle. And therefore it was so dangerous. Like the fact that it had been there for 20 years and nobody had broken there doesn't matter. And they got $170,000, and those things resonate with the world. I mean, when you have the possibility of being sued for almost anything, even something that is super safe, that once in a while, there's an anomaly, you start thinking that nothing is safe enough. We have a question though from one of our listeners, which is, how has social media affected the celebration of Halloween? Have you been thinking about that at all?
Well, yeah. One of the things that has happened is the first thing you need to understand is when people try and track down reports of contaminated treat, they always turn out to be hoaxes. Okay,
Right.
I mean, like 95% of them, and most of the hoaxers are the children. Okay, it is very easy. You take a Snickers bar, you stick a pin in it, and you run in and show your parents, look. Look what I found, and you're rewarded with the concerned attention of adults. And of course, it's perfectly consistent with the kind of Halloween trickery theme that runs through the holiday. And what's happened on social media is now that anybody with a smartphone, which is to say all children, and a social media presence, which is to say all children, is able to do this. There is a little town near where I live a few years ago, and there are a couple of guys who, young, probably junior high school age kids, who took a nail, stuck it in a candy bar, took a picture of it, posted it on Facebook, and said, "Look what we found." And the little town that they did this in, people got very excited, like, "Oh my God, this is very dangerous." And of course, the police went out and had a little conversation with them. Nobody else had found a nail in a candy bar. What do you suppose that is? And the kids owned up to it and said, "No, we just did it as a joke." But social media makes it very easy to keep these fears alive, because absolutely anybody can create evidence of a contaminated treat.
Yes.
There are funny memes now, finally, I'd say in the last year, possibly two, where it says, "Look what I found in my Snickers bar," and it shows you Jimmy Hoffa, or my third grade class, or, Sun Ra. So I'm happy that those are finally becoming fodder. It's really good. Another question, which is, let's talk a little bit about the adult takeover of Halloween. The fact that there's the parties, there's the trunk or treats, billions of dollars are spent by adults on their sexy witch costumes. What's happening there?
Well, this has become the second most commercially important holiday in the calendar, and after the winter holidays, of course. And a lot of it is adults. I mean, adults are doing various kinds of things. Shopping malls for decades have been saying, well, you can trick or treat safe at the wall, which of course, encourages, people to, it's well lit, but on the other hand, why you certain amount of impulse buying is probably looked for. Trunk or treating is usually organized by church congregations, but you have dressing up and lots of college students are going to costume parties and so on, and of course in recent years we've had the worries about culturally appropriating Halloween costumes and so on and so forth. But absolutely, adults are making this more of a holiday for adults.
But in a Protestant culture where we don't have Mardi Gras,
that's right.
Oh,
this become the equivalent of Mardi Gras?
Yeah. I'd say like, let's have Mardi Gras then, because the thing about Halloween that was so special, at least when I was growing up, was that it was the one day of the year that you really got to practice being a grown-up. I mean, you got to put on your work clothes, right? You cold called on strangers, you tried to make a sale, and you were out at night and you weren't with an adult. You were really, getting to know the neighborhood and becoming a human instead of just a child. And I just hear from a lot of people that there was somebody on our, we have a Facebook page called Raising Independent Kids. And a mom said that her 10-year-old and another 10-year-old were going to go trick-or-treating this year. And so she just wrote another note to the mom, like, okay, that sounds great. And that mom wrote back and said, only if we can go with them. And we're talking about two 10-year-olds. I'd say if one mom thinks it's probably safe enough, it probably is. So that's the part of the adult takeover that disturbs me less than the sexy nurse costumes, is the idea that we've taken away this Independence Day for kids and turned it into yet another adult supervised activity, often during the day and sometimes just trunk or treating. So
would this be a good time for Andrea to post that map?
Oh yeah, we'll post the map and then we got to go soon. So yeah, let's look at this map. So this is a map that I've loved for years and that Joel brought up the other day when we were chatting, and it's how children lost the right to roam in 4 generations. And Joel, talk us through the map.
Yeah, this appeared in a British newspaper, and this is 4 generations of kids, sort of in middle England someplace, and you can see the great grandfather was allowed to walk 6 miles to a place where he liked to go fishing when he was aged 8, and his son had a much smaller range. He was able to walk about a mile. His granddaughter, when she was 8, was able to go only about half a mile, and now you have the great grandson who's a little dot up the thing, who can walk to the end of his street. And this is not in a dangerous part of the world, and it just gives you a sense of, I think, how parents' comfort with setting boundaries for their children has changed so dramatically.
Yes, that's great.
Right.
Yeah.
Any advice on how to get a little more brave and send your kids out on their own in a group, but without you? Any suggestions?
I think people can do whatever they want on Halloween. If I never checked my kids' treats. I'm not convinced.
It'd be weird if you did, Joel. You are the world's leading authority on the fact that nobody has ever been poisoned by a stranger's candy. If you were checking your kids' treats, there'd be something weird.
Yeah, no, I never did it, but this is a very manageable fear. You can say, you can't go trick or treating. I have to go with you. You can only go to houses of people you know. We're going to go trick or treat in the mall. We'll trunk or treat at the church parking lot. And the nice thing is that you think about this as a fear, and the fear of the Halloween sadist is that down the block there is somebody who's so crazy that he poisons little children at random, but he's so tightly wrapped he only does it one night a year. Okay,
he's actually he's tightly unwrapped.
That's right. On November 1st, you can look around the breakfast table and everybody's still there, and you can say, we don't have to worry about that for another 364 days, right? I mean,
Yeah.
what a great thing to be afraid of. And
Yeah, I'd say yes, except that I do worry that, and not worry, I'm a fan of both of your books because I feel like fear, once it gets a toehold, then just expands, right? I feel like Halloween is like the test market. Oh, can they believe that, that crazy people are poisoning random children? Yes. Okay. Can they believe that, you better never knock on the door of, anybody whose lights are out because those are going to, they're going to pounce on your children. Yeah. So then you start, it's like the first sip of something that is going to become a big part of your life.
sure, yeah, no, I don't think it's rational to do all those things, but it's just people deal with this in all kinds of ways.
I think the problem is that we've lost trust. We don't trust our neighbors. We don't trust our community. And so once you lose trust, then those fears grow in place of those trusts.
Oh, that's so
And
true.
Halloween was an expression of trust in your neighborhood.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That is so true. And I do think of Let Grow, our movement, our mission here is to make it easy, normal, and legal to give kids back some independence so that they can grow up into, healthy, happy, confident, competent adults. And that starts with trust. And the one thing that we often suggest is like, it doesn't have to be on Halloween, but if you do let your children do something on their own, that's the only thing that brings back the trust, because you see that they're fine, you see that they're happy, they're excited, and then something, clicks in your brain. It's like, oh yeah, this is good, not bad. So with that, I have to thank you both for all your years of diligent study and research and writing, and then for spending this hour with us talking about where our fears come from on Halloween. And of course, I wish you a very happy Halloween. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and close up. I will send off a email with a number of links and things. There are a couple questions I'm sorry we weren't able to get to, but thanks so much. And tune in next month. We haven't picked the title yet, but we have a
it's a really cool one with yet another author friend, Nancy McDermott, who wrote a book about what happens when parents are always with their children, and what it does to the parents, what it does to the kid, and what it does to the relationship when there's not any breathing room between them. So
awesome. Turn that into a really catchy title, Lenore.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll see you next month. Thank you so much, Paula and Joel, and bye everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Happy